Hello everyone, this is Lincoln Prime, and I know I announced I would be stepping back from doing videos with high amounts of commentary due to health reasons, but this is a video I wanted to make as I feel it would be able to shine light on a new perspective, and today I will be breaking down my thoughts on the whole continuity debacle with the Transformers films. We are mostly all aware by now that the Transformers film franchise was rebooted after Transformers The Last Knight with the 2018 spin-off film Bumblebee. However, it wasn't always planned out this way, as The Last Knight, with its various contradictions to the previous four films, was meant to serve as the beginning of Paramount's slate for the Transformers cinematic universe, an idea that came into life in 2015 where various concepts and ideas were thrown out for mainstream films, spin-offs, prequels, and more. Unfortunately, this entire concept would fall apart with the poor reception of The Last Knight. I do recommend checking out this video for a more detailed explanation on the plans for what could have been. However, one of these ideas consisted of an animated prequel film that would take place on Cybertron before the war. In 2017, the project was announced and Josh Cooley was placed as its director. Now, we have to remember that everything that was planned was meant to serve as canon to the Michael Bay films, but like I mentioned earlier about the reboot, it was all scrapped. But some ideas still stayed. Bumblebee was already in production, so that film coming out was already a given, but other films like a Beast Wars movie, the animated Cybertron prequel, and the G.I. Joe crossover were all parts of that original plan that did end up coming to fruition. Even though the idea of a cinematic universe specifically in the Bayverse was scrapped, they are still sticking to some of those ideas in this new rebooted continuity, and honestly, I'm really happy about that. However, I do wish that Paramount wouldn't treat these films as experimental pieces and more like actual definitive projects. Examples of this being the different stylistic tones between the three newest films, and the admittedly poor marketing that they're solely trying to rely on the word-of-mouth tactic, which has not necessarily been working out in the eyes of many people, including myself. For example, with Rise of the Beast, there was one trailer in December of 2022, and about a 6-month dry spell of zero news and content about the film until the next trailer, which was released close to 2 months before the release of this film. This lack of promotion is what contributed to the lower box office numbers than Bumblebee, which at the time was already the lowest box office Transformers film ever. However, besides that, with this new film continuity in motion and the conflicting words of Lorenzo di Bonaventura, and what he has been stating as quote-unquote canon, we really have to look at what we know just by watching these films. With the Bay films, we see a mostly consistent style that he brings to the table. You can watch these films and tell that they were cooked up by the same people, but that style immediately changes when you get to Bumblebee, a movie that completely shifts away from the Bayhem and embraces something closer to what we see in G1. A more lighthearted tone without the occasional sex joke every 30 minutes. This tone continues in the sequel, Transformers Rise of the Beasts, where we see a bit of a more depressing side to these characters now that they have become a bigger focus. Unfortunately, the biggest issue is that it's kind of hard to really relate to them, as we haven't really had time to grow with these specific iterations of the characters. They clearly differ from their Bay counterparts in many ways, but they lack the proper amount of depth that I feel we would all like to see. In short, looking at Optimus Prime, for example, it's really hard to look at him and feel for him when we've only seen this specific iteration over the span of 2 films. We practically know nothing about him as they haven't really built on this specific version, and to an extent even the Michael Bay version of Prime lacks proper depth to his character even though he's featured in 5 overall films. And now we enter Transformers 1, the animated prequel that was planned to coincide with the live-action Bay films in 2015. This film brought a new perspective to the character, showing us a side we have never really seen before, but ultimately evolving into the character we grew up with. However, there's still much more evolving left to go for him and the Autobots, especially if we are able to get that full animated trilogy. However, this is where the question of continuity comes into play. If we look at what we are to expect, it's 2 separate Transformers film trilogies running side by side, disconnected from each other. However, I wouldn't say there is a complete disconnect. If we look at the aligned continuity, for example, we see that there are many stylistic differences between all of these projects. The video games, Transformers Prime / Robots in Disguise 2015, and Rescue Bots. All of these projects meant to be a definitive story taking place in its own contained timeline. However, major creative differences and ideas is what would lead to the concept becoming janky and confusing, and ultimately getting dropped completely after Rescue Bots Academy. But let's look at the video games and TFP specifically for a second. The games were created as a reimagining of the war before the events of the Generation 1 story, even though it was supposed to be tied to Transformers Prime. The interesting part is that TFP and the games aren't fully connected, and it's mainly due to the overall stylistic differences. In short, the designs separate the continuities. However, in Transformers Prime, they still reference Cybertron's past, which implies that the same exact events that occurred in the games still happened in the Transformers Prime timeline. It was essentially just executed visually differently, yet still is considered as part of the aligned continuity. I believe the same thing is happening at Paramount. Lots of clashing creative ideas, but are mostly being caused by one man, Lorenzo. Over the past few years, we've seen the directors and storytellers try to create ideas that exist within the bounds of which they want to tell it. Stephen Caple Jr. acknowledged the fact time and time again that Rise of the Beasts served as a part of the reboot continuity and as a direct sequel to Bumblebee. Yet Lorenzo says otherwise and tries to say that these reboot films are not reboots and in fact, quote-unquote, part of the same continuum with the Bay films. Which of course is far from the case, as it doesn't really make any sense. Coming back to Transformers 1, we see a similar narrative with director Josh Cooley, who has stated that his film is set in its own continuity quite a few times. But Lorenzo still continues his charades of stating that it's all part of the same continuity, which, based on the events of the films, would create even more confusion if this was even close to the case of being accurate. We have to remember also that Lorenzo even stated when the Bumblebee movie was coming out that the film stood as a reboot to the franchise. However, with the lower box office numbers of the film due to being a follow-up release to what is agreeably the worst received film in the franchise, it's safe to assume that Lorenzo switched up his previous statements and is only saying what he says about the films in fact being part of the Bayverse because he believes that if these films have some sort of tie to Michael Bay, people will want to go see it even more. This is honestly a dangerous tactic because now we have 3 continuities and one producer who utilizes his position and power to try to persuade the audience's train of thought towards these films because of their ties to someone, Michael Bay, who hasn't even been behind the direction of a Transformers movie in almost a decade. But coming back to Transformers 1, we have to remember that a film like this would not have worked in a live-action setting due to how expensive that would be to produce. It would have to be animated whether or not it's connected to the live-action films. There's no doubt that this film would have served as a prequel to Bumblebee had the studio been financially capable of producing it in live-action, which is why I do feel there is some semblance of continuity between this film and specifically the live-action reboots. But I also view this movie as its own thing, specifically due to the visual style that differentiates itself from the reboot movies. The thing that matters to me the most is the stories. Transformers 1 is set in its own continuity because of its visual execution, but that doesn't mean the story it tells and the events that unfold did not necessarily happen before the events of Bumblebee. Like the Cybertron games to Transformers Prime, same events, different visual execution. It's important for these animated movies to exist because they will help to flesh out the characters we see in Bumblebee and Rise of the Beasts even more than they already were in the first place. And it's not because of the visual difference, it's because of the stories that are told and that will continue to be told throughout these films' releases. The answer of whether or not these movies are connected isn't exactly no, but it isn't yes either. It's more or less what we, the audience, decide, as it is only a generalized story that explains the origins of the characters we know. So maybe it works as an explanation of G1, TFP, IDW, the films, because at the end of the day, it's what you want it to be, and in this case, there really is no right or wrong answer. But I do think that we can all agree that continuity debacle aside, we can all appreciate this film for what it is as a tribute to the franchise as a whole, and it stands strong in those regards alone. Anyways guys, I hope this helped to open your eyes to a new perspective on how to look at these new films, and I only hope that this can help to put an end to some of the infighting between the fandom. I've seen lots of people gatekeeping the continuities, putting down fellow fans, etc., and it's honestly disheartening to see. People should be allowed to decide what they want to view this film as without the conflict and corrections. We are all here for the same thing, and it's Transformers. Anyways guys, I hope you all enjoyed this video. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.